Welcome to Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School. A few years ago, on the way back from California, we lived in West Texas. We were coming back to West Texas. We stopped by the Grand Canyon. It was the first time I'd seen the Grand Canyon from ground level. I'd flown over it many times and even had pilots sort of tip the plane so you could get a good view out of one side of the plane as you flew over the Grand Canyon. But standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon, there's nothing that can really compare to that in terms of viewing this giant hole in the ground. And I couldn't really get my fill of it. I'd go to one place and look at it, and then I'd go to another place and it looked a little different, and go to another place and it looked different. Every time I looked at that canyon from a different location, I saw different things about it, different aspects to the beauty. The gospel writers are sort of the same way. They're all looking at the life of Christ. They're looking at the same basic thing, but they see different facets. They see different pictures, different things happening in Jesus' life. And so now that we've kind of gone through Mark and looked at the sweep of his life, the outline, if you will, of Jesus' ministry, now we're going to go back to the other gospel writers and see how they treat it differently. What facets they see of that ministry that the other gospel writers don't. We're going to start with Matthew. Matthew is himself a Jew. We know him also by the name of Levi, the tax collector. Even though he was a Jew, probably was pretty much despised by the rest of the Jews as a traitor. They would have seen him as working for the Romans. And not only that, but he made his living by ripping off the people that he collected taxes from. He was entitled to collect a little more for his wages, but most tax collectors lived pretty cushy lives, and Matthew was probably one of those. One of the 12. Mark was not one of the 12 disciples. Matthew is. And it appears that Matthew writes to, at the very least, an audience very aware of the Old Testament and very well versed in the Hebrew Scriptures, and probably a very Jewish audience as well. Matthew's gospel begins in a way that we generally skip over, and in Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School, we're not going to skip over that, because they didn't teach you this in Sunday school. The first line of Matthew's gospel, the book of the genealogy, and most of us, when we see the word genealogy, we start dozing off right away. We're not going to doze off. We're going to look at this because there's some good stuff in this genealogy. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David. Matthew uses that phrase, the son of David, to describe Jesus more than the other three gospel writers put together. And if you're writing to Jews or people who are very well versed in the Old Testament, calling Jesus the son of David would bring up all kinds of images about who this Messiah was. And then he calls him the son of Abraham. And then he launches into a genealogy, not one that starts with Adam, but one that starts with Abraham. So it's a genealogy based on the nation. Abraham's the father of the nation. Adam was the father of humanity. So he begins with Abraham, and he begins with the beginning of the nation of Israel. And he includes some people in there that you would expect. In verse 2, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah. Verse 3, I'm going to point out some skeletons in the closet here. Verse 3, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Now, way back in Stuff They Didn't Teach Me in Sunday School, way back in Genesis, we looked at the story of Tamar. Tamar was Judah's daughter-in-law. Her husband died. She had no children. That meant her husband had no children credited to him, and she was owed some children, as was her dead husband. His brothers failed to give her sons, and so she finally resorted to trickery, dressed up as a prostitute, seduced her father-in-law, and became pregnant by her father-in-law. That one doesn't make Sunday school lessons for sure. And here she is in the genealogy. Tamar as one of Jesus' ancestors. And if you go on down a little farther, and Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab. Rahab was a harlot, a prostitute, who sheltered the spies who came into Jericho. And Boaz, the father of Obed by Ruth, and Ruth's a Moabite, not a Jew. There's all kinds of little skeletons in the closet here in Jesus' ancestry to give you a hint, by the way, that Jesus came for sinners and that Jesus came for Gentiles. And then, of course, you do have some biggies. Jesse, the father of David. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, not named here, but Bathsheba. And you remember that story from the Old Testament, how David got Bathsheba pregnant out of wedlock and, in fact, had her husband killed so that he could marry her. And one of the products of that union is Solomon, who is in this bloodline of Jesus as well. In verse 9, you have probably one of the best kings of Israel mentioned, Hezekiah. And in verse 10, his son, one of the worst kings of Israel, Manasseh. Verse 13, you have Zerubbabel. He led some of the captives as they came back out of exile in Babylon. Interesting genealogy. Interesting also in how it ends. If you look at verse 16, and Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. So you have this whole genealogy that starts with Abraham, goes through all these generations, and ends, for crying out loud, with Joseph, who is not Jesus' blood father, who is his stepfather, but who is his legal father. And so what you have in Matthew's gospel is a legal lineage of Jesus Christ. Not a biological lineage, because it ends with Joseph, not Mary. Then Matthew does something fascinating. Verse 17. So all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations. So Abraham to David. And then God does a new thing with David, starts the Davidic line. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. And from the deportation to Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. Isn't that a neat package? 14 generations of God working through this nation. And then he does a new thing, still with the nation, but now the monarchy with David. 14 generations, and then he does a new thing. He takes them off into exile. And 14 generations, and then he does a new thing in Jesus Christ. Now, for the Western mind, there's just one little problem with that. To make that work out, Matthew skips some generations. Back in Matthew chapter 1, verse 8, the end of the verse, he says, Joram is the father of Uzziah. Actually, Joram is the father of Ahaziah, who is the father of Joash, who is the father of Amaziah. He skipped 3 generations, and not 3 generations that people would know, 3 generations of kings. This would be like if you listed the presidents of the United States and skipped 3 in a row. It's not going to take long before somebody figures out that you skipped 3 in a row. Well, he skipped 3 kings in a row to make this come out to 14, 14, 14. Why? That bugs us. Western mindset, that bothers us. Why does he do this? Because he's got a deeper meaning. 14 is twice 7. And in Hebrew thinking and symbolism for numbers, 7 is the number of completeness. So God does a thing from Abraham to David. It's a complete thing, 14 generations. He does a thing from David to Babylon, to the exile. It's a complete thing. It's a complete package. 14 generations. Happens to be 17, but he calls it 14. And then he does a complete thing from Babylon to the coming of Christ, 14 generations. And he's setting the stage to tell you and to tell me, God is doing a new thing here. What he's doing is a brand new thing. It's a whole new thing, a new group of 14, which will go on long beyond 14. But it is the Messianic age. It is Jesus Christ, God come in the flesh, come to be the Savior of the world. That 14 thing bugs us when we know that it's 17 in that one package of generations. But it wouldn't bother a Jew at all. They would say, I get what he's trying to say. So think like a Jew on this one. Think like a Hebrew. And think about what he's trying to say. He's trying to tell you God is doing a new thing in Jesus Christ.